Well, hello, everybody. My name's Mark Littlewood. Thank you very much for joining us for this PopCon review of 2024. And my, oh my, what a lot happened. Some of it good, most of it bad. I'm joined by three of my PopCon colleagues dotted around our great nation to chew the fat of what has happened over the past 12 months. I'm Mark Littlewood, the director of PopCon. I'm joined by Sam Collins, our head of public affairs from deepest, darkest Cambridgeshire. Sam, how are you? How is deepest, darkest Cambridgeshire?
It's all right. It's a bit rainy, but we managed to avoid flooding this week, so that's pretty good.
I'm joined by Andrew Allison, our head of campaigns from even deeper, even darker Yorkshire. How's Yorkshire, Andrew? How are you?
Yeah, even darker. We haven't seen the sun in about a week.
And Annunziata Rees-Mogg, our head of communications from bright, sunny, airy, beautiful Lincolnshire. How are things there?
Yeah, glorious. Except for it is winter in Britain.
Yeah, much the same applies here in Battersea, London. But let's kick off. We go back right the way to January 2024. PopCon had not yet come into existence. That major public event you're going to have to wait till February for. But a couple of things did happen in January, and there's one I wanted to ask your guys' reflections on. The Rwanda bill passed in Parliament, its third reading. And I can remember at the time being somewhat ambivalent about it all. It's obviously now an historical artifact, at least for the time being. But this was the grand plan to really prove that we'd stop the boats by flying some planes. I was a bit skeptical that it was ever going to get through our law courts because of the ability to procrastinate and delay through all sorts of human rights legislation. I was also a bit struck by what the actual capacity of these flights were. You know, how many people were we actually going to get off the ground? If you had, you know, tens of thousands of people that you were intending to deport, did a sort of, you know, a plane with 9 people on it really scratch the surface? But it seemed to me that the Sunak government was at least trying to do something. As I say, it's an historical artifact now, but looking back on it, Andrew, I think I'll start with you. What did you think? Oh yeah, at last there's some strategy to actually patrol our borders and deport people, or do we now think this was all just a bit of a joke and window dressing?
It was a bit of a sort of a yes and no answer from me, I think, there, Mark. It wasn't particularly strong enough, as the ERG will tell you, the European Research Group of Conservative MPs. But I suppose it was better than nothing. And there were signs that that migrants were escaping the UK, going through Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland, and therefore it was actually working. So maybe it was a deterrent, and it did have that effect. But of course, we'll never know because, as we'll discuss as we go on in this podcast, Rishi called that general election way too early, and if he called it about now, well, called it for now, November or December, then I think we would have had a much better idea as to whether that Rwanda scheme had worked or not.
Yeah, Annunziata will never know, but best guess, madcap idea or part of the solution?
I have to absolutely admit that when I first heard about it, I thought it was a completely insane idea. I had no belief in it at all. The only element of it that I did believe in was the idea it was a deterrent. But for it to be a deterrent, it had to happen. And people actually had to take off from here in decent numbers. And we'll never know. Could it have worked? I don't know. Other countries started copying it. It seemed like perhaps it did have merit. But we're not going to find out because the moment we got to the election, Keir Starmer got rid of that entire concept. And I think Germany took our places in Rwanda.
I think Arsenal Football Club are still sponsored by Visit Rwanda. It must be the only major football club sponsored by a completely failed government policy, but there you have it. Sam, what was your take on it? And, you know, what might have happened in a parallel universe?
I mean, my problem with it was much like the pretty average immigration reforms that Boris tried to bring in. It was an attempt to bring Australian or New Zealand immigration policy to Britain. Now, for those of you who don't know, in Australia, they've got a system where if you try to arrive in Australia by boat, they divert you up to Nauru and put you in effectively an internment camp there while your asylum is processed. Now, I mean, that works when it's an island off the coast of your country. I mean, if we were doing it in the Isle of Man, that might have been a reasonable suggestion. But
The Isle of Man might not have thought so, but
well, true. Or the if it had been somewhere in the geographical vicinity of the Isle of Man, maybe. But schlepping everybody to Rwanda, it was always going to be an incredibly expensive policy that would be difficult to actually do anything. However, you're right that it did have a deterrent element. I don't know. I mean, I would like to think that having a policy that was actively getting rid of people might have helped, diffuse some of the anger that led to the Southport riots over the summer. But frankly, I don't think it was a policy that was really going to get to grips with the issue.
Also worth saying, in early January it was, I think, just to prove that some politicians do make promises and keep them. Rishi Sunak, I think, first said in a media interview that his working assumption was that the general election would be in the second half of 2024. We'll come to that. We'll come to that fateful decision a little later in the show. Look, moving on to February, and I know this is a bit internal facing, but let's talk about PopCon launching. That was in early February. We burst onto the scene. It was only Sam and I on the sort of payroll at the time, along with Angela, who's producing this show, and we had some support from others as well to get things going. But we made quite a splash, really. It was a packed event, an absolute media scrum, vast numbers of folk there from all sorts of walks of life, donors, think tankers, members of parliament, media, all of the rest. And we sort of arrived on the scene with a rather bigger bang than I was expecting. Sam, you were the brains behind putting together quite a lot of this this major media event and making sure that we burst heroically onto the scene of British politics. What are your memories about that?
Well, I was tempted when you first started talking about January to refer to it as the dark times before PopCon launch, because obviously
right.
that, but it was certainly an experience, I have to admit. And being the person who was dealing with a lot of the behind the scenes stuff, like trying to organize who was going to come, the number of people, we probably could have filled that hall 2 or 3 times over by the time with the number of people who applied for places. So there's a huge amount of interest, which I think shows that there was a real latent demand for an organisation like PopCon to be making these sort of arguments. But my goodness gracious me, it was a whirlwind last few weeks, Mark, trying to get all the bits and pieces together. But I thought it went really, really well, and the fact that we managed to fill the bigger hall, I don't want to. No spoilers for later in the year, but the fact we could fill the larger hall at the Emmanuel Centre, 5 months later, I think shows that it was pretty successful.
Now, Annunziata, you were there. You weren't working for us at the time, but I think you wrote a piece in the Telegraph, was it? What was your take on it? I mean, I was really pleased with how the launch went, but I was also somewhat surprised about how much interest there was. I just thought I was setting up a group that was going to make kind of philosophical and policy argument within the Conservative Party, but it was an absolute scrum, and we had to turn away hundreds of people who would have been really interested in being there for it. And I think we were trending on Twitter throughout the day. Literally thousands of people signed up via our website to become supporters. What was your take of it, Siata? Well, and be upbeat. Don't say it was terrible, by the way. That's not in the script.
It was very, very far from terrible. It was extraordinary. I've got a background in working for think tanks, not since 2005, but I've stayed in touch with a lot They don't launch like that. They don't have that impact. It was a very, very different feeling to any right of centre event I've ever been to. There was a real passion, enthusiasm. People were overflowing. You might have filled it. You overfilled it, despite the fact there were limits thanks to health and safety. The press wanted to know what was going on. It was an extraordinary triumph, and is part of the reason that I'm now here. That it was clearly something that had a very big backing behind it, and the reason for that, we need to exist. There needs to be a PopCon.
Andrew, you were watching on from afar. What was your take on us getting underway? I remember I'd spoken to you, and you couldn't attend the launch, but you know, I was interested in your thoughts, even though you weren't on Team PopCon at the time. What are your thoughts now in retrospect?
Well, at the time, I thought it was fantastic. Just echo what Annunziata and Sam have said. Never seen anything quite like it before. It was a major SW1 event, and it became a sort of a major event inside the Conservative Party, amongst activists, amongst the rank and file. It answered and continues to answer a need inside the Conservative Party. From members who want more internal democracy and want proper conservatism. And you're wearing that wonderful cap that we'll touch upon later, you know, make the Tories conservative again, and that's what people wanted. So it was absolutely, you know, fantastic launch, and it couldn't have gone better. And you know, so I was very happy to join the team a couple of months later.
Okay. Nothing else of any import happened in the month of February, I'm happy to report. So, but that was obviously the big event for us, and we were underway. Moving on to March, though, perhaps slightly attached to the launch, coming off the back of that, Lee Anderson, one of the speakers at our launch event, defects to Reform UK and becomes their first sitting member of Parliament, if you don't count their predecessor party of UKIP. He'd been suspended by the Tories on the 24th of February. He had the whip suspended after he'd made comments on GB News claiming Islamists had got control of London and its mayor Sadiq Khan. And off he popped to Reform UK, giving an alternative party on the centre-right a shot in the arm. You know, he's not the. There'll be many more stories to come about others who spoke at that launch event. Annunziata, you've got a history back in the Brexit Party in the day as a Brexit Party MEP. You're now back in the Conservative fold. But what did you make of that Anderson defection? Was it a shrug of the shoulders, or did you think this might be the dawn of Reform becoming a more and more serious player on the scene? Worth saying, I think at the time their poll ratings, you know, were not stratospheric by any manner or means, that they looked like they could be, you know, a feature of the general election, but not perhaps a particularly major one.
I think I thought that he was and is a bit of a maverick, but that's
good, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. There was nothing that he'd done that should have meant the Tories should have kicked him out. They shouldn't have suspended the whip in the first place. Yes, it was controversial. He did not mean what he said in any kind of racist way. He meant it in a political way, pure and simple. And it's what people in Lincolnshire might say any day of the week, but it's not just Lincolnshire, it's the rest of the country. If you're not in the Westminster bubble, what he said was perfectly acceptable. And I think the Tories got far too sensitive, far too worried about the woke centre under our previous leaders to be sensible and pragmatic and realistic about how to represent the British people.
Andrew, was this the first sign that the Conservatives' great pitch to the nation in the upcoming general election was going to be to that enormous cohort of people who are woke, highly sensitive, and on the centre-right of British politics?
Well, certainly the woke and sensitive bit. I think the Conservative Party's been pandering to that for goodness knows how many years, probably decades, really. I mean, going back to Lee Anderson, I mean, yeah, he is a loose cannon, but I mean, Rishi Sunak knew he was a loose cannon when he appointed him one of the deputy chairs of the Conservative Party. I mean, it was hardly breaking news, was it? I certainly wouldn't have taken the whip away from him. I think it was a huge mistake. Although I do have to say, when he defected to Reform, I did feel that that would be the end of his sort of political career. As you quite rightly said, Reform were in single digits, or maybe hovering around 10% at the time, but, you know, nowhere near what they are now, put it that way. And I just thought, well, he's probably stands a good chance of losing that seat to Labour. In the end, he did very well, and good on him for that. But I think, yes, in hindsight, you could say that that it was a huge mistake suspending him, for suspending the whip from him. But I actually think with a bit of foresight, if Ritchie had used that, he would have seen that it was going to be a mistake.
And Sam, what was your take on Lee's departure from the Tory throng? Worth saying he's the only person on the panel who spoke that day who's still a member of Parliament.
That's a very good point, actually. I do it. So my response was in two halves. The first half was, "Oh my God, he was on our stage a month ago. What that this is such a this is awful." But then my second thought was that that showed that to me properly that the Conservatives weren't seriously going to try and rebuild their 2019 coalition at the next election. That they were going even if it wasn't a deliberate choice, that they were defaulting back to the 2010, 2015 type of voter who didn't get them there in 2010 and just got them there in 2015, and were abandoning a lot of the voters who got that stonking majority in 2019. And I don't think it was necessarily a deliberate choice from them, but the fact that as Andrew and Annunziata have already said, that it wasn't particularly bad comments, and were comments that a lot of people across the red wall would have not even sort of raised an eyebrow at. And so it just seemed to me that very obvious that at that stage the party was not going to be talking to those red wall 2019 voters at the next election, and that's what it turned out to be.
And in the very next month, the Sunak electoral strategy became even clearer in the month of April. No longer was he merely appealing to very woke, highly sensitive centre-right voters, that particularly big cohort, but he added to that cohort that he also wanted to appeal to people who hated smoking. That the Tobacco and Vaping Bill passed by colossal majority, I think nearly 400 votes to about 60 rebels. I think the 60 rebels were nearly all Conservatives, including the present leader of the party, I should add, if I've remembered that correctly. Look, it's an issue very close to my heart and even closer to my lungs. But this sort of signaled to me that the Tory government had completely lost the plot, following on from Rishi Sunak's, conference speech the previous year, where the big plan was ban cigarettes, cancel half of HS2, and reform A-levels, as if these were the major preoccupations of a disillusioned British electorate. How did the Conservatives end up in this kind of weird position? It's not so much that I'm criticising the kind of lack of ideological soundness. I am, but I'm principally challenging the kind of total triviality of all of this, with everything that was going on in the world and the plight of the economy and the appalling unpopularity of the Conservative government. This just seemed that there was no fire in the belly, no fight at all. We were just going to do these sort of very weird, unconservative retail sort of policy that nobody really cared about. How on earth did the government get into the weeds here, basically?
Because they had no vision, they had no beliefs. I have no qualms anymore about thoroughly criticising Rishi Sunak, the way he got to power in the first place. I was not the biggest Boris supporter, but he certainly had a popular mandate, and they essentially executed him. That was the wrong thing to do. As far as I can tell, Rishi Sunak is what they call pragmatist. I would call a wet. He doesn't have any great belief in conservative values, but micromanaging is his expertise. And I think you're absolutely right that the bills at that point, when it was every child should do maths to 18. I remember my then 13-year-old saying, I don't want to do maths. I'm rubbish at maths. I love all sorts of other things. And she's got 1,000,001 talents. But I'm someone
should have said that she'll do maths as long as you let her smoke,
Oh, and we literally discussed that her cousins, Jacob's children, would be allowed to buy cigarettes, and they would sell them on the black market to her should she want to smoke. She doesn't smoke, as it happens, but it was an absurd situation. Half of Jacob's kids could have legally bought cigarettes. The other half would not be able to when they were 80-year-olds.
Yeah.
I mean, it was completely mad, completely unconservative. But it's because there was no belief behind it. That if you don't believe in actual conservative values, which I'm afraid to say there is a tranche of the political parliamentary party that don't, then where do you go? Everything's going wrong. You try and find something you think the public might like. I don't know that the public did like that.
Largely don't care about it, really. I mean, it's not the burning issue on the minds of any voters one way or t'other, is it? I mean,
it's completely irrelevant. But you try and find stupid little things to keep people happy, in quotes, and they don't keep people happy. People see them for the tokenism they are, and the people who are on your side think they're terrible because they are terrible.
So, Sam, what did you make of this? That the great pitch to the nation was, you must do algebra, you mustn't smoke, and if you don't eat your greens, you'll be sent to bed early. I'm not sure they quite legislated for that third one, but it wouldn't have surprised me if they'd attempted to.
I mean, I think Annunziata put it very well. It just was the sign of a government that was bereft of a big idea, and also that a government that was both didn't have the money to undertake significant. So it seems to me very obvious that they wanted to improve education and improve health. Now, from their point of view, there was no money to spend massively more on the NHS or education, and they didn't have the guts to undertake significant reforms of either. So at that stage, you're sort of grasping for anything that you could possibly do that would improve the health and education. And we'll force people, ban smoking, and force people to do mathematics. The thing I found really fascinating is the example that people always use. I mean, New Zealand, where I'm from, was the first country to undertake such madcap legislation as banning anybody over the born after a certain year from ever buying
this
tobacco.
year-by-year prohibition. So yeah.
So New Zealand was the first one to introduce it under the extremely left-wing government of Jacinta Ardern, and a lot of people used this as an example and said, "Oh, isn't it wonderful? We're going to be the second country following New Zealand." And by the time it actually came up in the House of Commons, the incoming Conservative government in New Zealand had reversed it, saying it was a disgraceful impact on people's personal freedoms and a complete waste of time, and would provide a lot of money to organised crime. So it turned out, and the black market. So even the underlying argument had gone by the time that actually came up in Parliament.
Andrew, if I ever get round to doing a PhD, which I almost certainly won't, given my advancing years, but I was wondering whether I should do it on the definition of Sunakism, because I think it would be a pretty short doctorate. How are we supposed to understand what Sunakism was? I mean, obviously, I don't think anybody suggested there was an overarching philosophy, but I couldn't really even get my head around the sort of basic instincts that he had.
Yeah, I mean, just to prove that we had no idea what the questions were going to be before we came onto this this recording, I think that proves it. Define Sunakism. I don't think he could define it himself, and it would certainly be a very short thesis, without a doubt. I think it's been touched upon already. He's just a manager, basically. He's just a bureaucrat. He doesn't really have any political instincts at all. I don't think he has any firm ideas one way or the other. Sam mentioned a government that lacked a big idea. That is true, but basically he's lacked ideas, full stop. He just didn't know what to do. We've been in government in one way or another for 14 years, and the irony is that when you point to Conservative successors, people start talking about welfare reform, education reform, but that all happened under the coalition with the Liberal Democrats. It didn't happen when we had a majority. Now, we're a little bit unlucky in the sense that Theresa May became Prime Minister and she squandered that majority immediately in 2017. Boris got his 80-seat majority and then COVID hit. So, yeah, there was a little bit of bad luck there along the way. But even with Boris, I mean, was he conservative, really? I mean, what sort of conservative policies was he pushing? He went to the United Nations General Assembly, I think the year 2021, I think it would have been. And he mentioned Kermit the Frog and how hard it is being green, but it's not really that hard to be green. And I mean, was this conservatism? Not conservatism that I recognised. So I think the drift was going on for a very long time. I'm a purist in the sense that I don't think we've had a proper conservative leader since Margaret Thatcher.
Never let people forget that the most right-wing period of government that we've had in recent years was when the Liberal Democrats were in government. That gives you an indication of it. Thank you for watching the first part of this PopCon review of the year. The remaining 3 parts will be released over the coming days, so make sure to keep an eye on our socials for updates.